That did not surprise me one bit coming from you, David. Before I introduce Dr. Jeff Miller tonight, just a couple of housekeeping chores to make sure we're all on the same page. One, if you have questions, please wait between sessions to ask Jeff. He'd be glad to answer them then so he can get through the series. Two, I wanted to explain, a lot of times we hear what the word apologetics is, but do we truly understand what it is? And I wanted to identify this, brief definition tonight, so when you understand when you talk about apologetics press and what they represent, you know what they stand for. Apologetics refers to the defense of the Christian faith through reasoned arguments, evidence, writings, and scripture. And I think if we read 1 Peter 3:15, we all have a responsibility to be able to defend the faith whenever we're questioned about it. The series tonight is, Does Science Support Creation? Dr. Jeff Miller comes to us from Montgomery, Alabama, where he serves as the director of the Creation Research Program of Apologetics Press. He's the associate editor of AP's monthly Christian Evidences Journal for Adults, Reason and Revelation, as well as the editor of AP Bible Class Curriculum. Not only does Jeff serve AP in the above capacities, Dr. Miller is currently an adjunct instructor for Freed-Hardeman University teaching physical science courses on the flood in Arizona. Dr. Miller is highly qualified to teach on the subject of creation evolution. He has participated and continues to participate in several creation geologic field expeditions with leading creation geologists and paleontologists, where he has assisted in the excavation of several dinosaur fossils from the Lance Formation in Wyoming, studies in the Grand Canyon, and various sites throughout the United States. He is an active and recognized member of the scientific community. He consistently holds seminars throughout the United States on science and evolution, creation, adult and teen seminars, culture cancer that is systematically destroying the U.S. And if you're wondering what that is, you understand what woke, DEI, and everything else is. So I don't need to go any deeper. He also has tours of the biblical flood tours in Arizona, particularly in the Grand Canyon area, in relevant locations. Now, as far as his geography, Jeff needs a lesson on that, because he teaches at he does seminars at the Creation Museum and Ark Encounter tours in my home state of Kentucky. He said it was in Greater Cincinnati. That's across the river, okay? So, just wanted to clarify that. There are 10 principles of truth on Apologetics Press website, two of which I would like to mention before we begin. The first one, faith in God and the Bible are based on evidences and not blindly accepted. That's justified in 1 Thessalonians 5:21, Acts 17:11, 1 John 4:1. And two, God exists, and humanity can know that God exists by means of his manifold revelations, both in nature and through the inspired Word of God, the Holy Bible. Dr. Miller.
I'm excited to be here. You know, I love being in Arizona. My dad grew up down the road from here, and I spend a lot of time in northern Arizona these days teaching young people about the flood up there, and hopefully I'll be able to talk some more about that as the weekend goes on. A lot of material I want to be able to cover this weekend, and I tend to teach this stuff maybe differently than you will have seen. It's a lot of information in a short amount of time, so I hope you ate your Wheaties. You're going to need a lot of Wheaties this weekend to stay on top of this material we're going to be plowing through. We spend a lot of time in the church and at Apologetics Press, where I work, countering evolutionary theory, and we have to do that. It is, statistically, we're seeing that it is eroding faith in the Bible in a widespread way in our country. There's a mass exodus going on from the church over that single issue, according to the statistics. And so we as Christians examine the evidence, we counter evolutionary thinking, but what about our model? So many evolutionists turn around, point the finger at us and say, you know, you guys are spending all this time trying to pick holes in our model. Where's your model? I mean, we at least have one. That's better than what you guys have. We at least have a model, a framework that we can use to do science. Creationists can't even claim to be scientific without having a legitimate model. So for example, 2007, famous skeptic Michael Shermer published a book where he tried to make a case against intelligent design and against creation and for evolution. He's a very influential writer and had a column in Scientific American for many years. Here's one of the things he said in his book. For creationists to disprove evolution, they need to unravel all these independent lines of evidence that he talks about in his book, as well as construct a rival theory that can explain them better than the theory of evolution. They have yet to do so, he says. He says, intelligent design creationists have no science to speak of. We're not doing science, he says. If creationists want their doctrines taught in public school science classes, they need first to develop a science, and then to convince scientists that their scientific ideas merit inclusion based on the quality of the arguments and the evidence. Now, Herbert Spencer was a famous philosopher from the 1800s, and he said, those who cavalierly reject the theory of evolution as not adequately supported by facts seem quite to forget that their own theory is supported by no facts at all. Whenever you hear only one side of the story, which is what's happened in our country for decades now, it's easy to believe that side until you get to hear the other side too, Proverbs 18:17. And I find it's amazing. We can often change our position once we just hear the other side of the story on this. So notice the second half of Shermer's argument here. Creationists need a rival theory that can explain the evidence better than the evolutionary model, and according to him, we haven't done that. And so this is a real argument that evolutionists are using today against biblical creation. So notice that defeating error is good. That's important. We have to do that. But it doesn't at the same time teach the truth. So it leaves a vacuum that has to be filled with something. So how do we know that our perspective is correct? Creation. Does the evidence support this, particularly in the area of science? I mean, science has really become, the God of the world around us, right? That is ultimately what's causing 4 out of 10 of our young people are leaving the church when they leave home. And about half of them are doing so because they think science doesn't support biblical creation. So do we have a model that can be used as a framework for scientific study? In this heavenly scientific day, this is an important question that young people especially need answers to. In philosophy, there is a law we call the law of rationality that says one should only draw those conclusions that are warranted by the evidence. In other words, you should only believe something that you can substantiate with facts, that you can prove with the evidence. And this is a biblical idea. 1 Thessalonians 5:21, test all things, or examine everything carefully, hold fast to that which is good. Right? So the idea, God doesn't want you to just blindly accept something. He wants you to examine the evidence and come to logical conclusions based on that evidence. He doesn't want you to blindly believe that He exists or that the Bible's inspired. He expects us to weigh the evidence and come to the right conclusion based on that evidence that is sufficient to force us to the conclusion that God exists and the Bible's His Word. We can actually know the truth that'll set us free. John 8:32, not just blindly believe it based on some kind of vague tinglies or something that we get. So biblical faith, regardless of what the religious world around us says, according to the Bible, faith is not blind. It is not a blind leap into the dark, hoping that there's somebody there at the bottom of the cliff to catch us. That would be what is often called fideism. According to the Merriam-Webster dictionary, it says reliance on faith rather than reason in pursuit of religious truth. So notice that modern dictionaries, which are just basically telling us how terms are being used by our society today, modern dictionaries put faith in contrast to reasoning and evidence, because that's what the bulk of the religious world has come to believe about faith. But biblical faith is not this. This is not what the Bible teaches about faith. Biblical faith is the same kind of trust that you have in anybody based on whether or not a person has proven themselves to be trustworthy. So it's based on evidence. You have to have evidence that forces you to a conclusion that you should trust somebody. And this is the kind of faith that God expects us to have in him. And God has left us evidence in many forms, and probably the most obvious form that shouts out to us is from the things that are made. Since the creation of the world, God's invisible attributes are clearly seen. How? Being understood by the things that are made, the creation around us. Even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. In other words, we can look at the things that are made and draw a logical conclusion that there has to be a God, and even learn some things about the nature of that God. And there's so much evidence for God that on Judgment Day, you're not going to be able to say, God, this wasn't my fault. This is your fault. You didn't give me enough proof. No. He says you'll be without excuse if you don't come to this conclusion, because the evidence is too abundant around us that'll force you to draw the right conclusion about this. So it's crucial that we have evidence for the creation model, and that we're ready to talk to other people about this in this heavily scientific age in which we live, where science is being used to choke the true model of our origins. We have to be able to fill the void that we leave when we counter false ideas with a model that can be shown to harmonize with the actual evidence. We need to fill the void with the true model of our origins before other false models fill in that gap. You know, it's not like there's only one creation model out there. Most people on the planet believe in a God. It's just not the right God. They've got a creation model. We got to be able to fill the void with the true model of origins for people. And that is what we want to try to do this weekend, very briefly, but systematically make the case for the biblical creation model. So if a person is going to try to just build the creation model in a systematic way from the ground up to most of society around us today, rather than having a blind faith, really the first thing you're going to have to do is show that there has to be a God. There's a God out there, and the evidence demands that. And then you're going to have to show that that God is specifically the God of the Bible, and then show that the Bible really is his word. Right? And then you can lay out the actual biblical creation model with regard to the origin and history of the universe based on what the Bible says, especially as it relates to any major things that could shape how we understand the universe around us. And then he's going to need to show that this is a valid model in answering the charge of Michael Shermer, for example, showing that it is supported by the evidence, that it is verified by examining the evidence. And finally, he can show that this is a robust model. That is, it can withstand scrutiny and criticism. It can be defended. In other words, we can engage in apologetics with this. And so this is the goal this weekend. This is what we want to do in the sessions that are coming after this one and starting really right now. So concerning the very first plank, the idea that there has to be a God, in studying the universe over the centuries, studying the evidence, humans have reasoned through from the evidence and articulated many excellent philosophical arguments that point to the conclusion that there has to be some being that ultimately created this universe. And these arguments continue to stand as testaments to the existence of God. They've been around for thousands of years in some cases. Blair Scott of American Atheists, for example, he said the theological arguments have not changed much over thousands of years, okay? And he meant that as a scoff, a jab at creationists whenever he made that statement, but really he's right. The classical arguments have been around a long time. They haven't needed to change. They continue to stand as testaments, not having been refuted. More and more evidence just continues to pile up for these. Truth doesn't need to change. And in fact, in the words of the famous British cosmologist and evolutionist Fred Hoyle, this is the guy that coined the term Big Bang. He said you should be suspicious of a theory if more and more hypotheses are needed to support it. If you have to keep twisting and distorting a theory in order to stay in line with the latest evidence, you should be suspicious of that theory. And it is ironic that that would perfectly describe naturalistic theories if you stay up with the science on what's going on with the Big Bang and Darwinian evolution, for example. But the classical arguments that demand the existence of a God haven't needed to change. They've stood the test of time, have not been disproven. So, for example, here's just a handful of these. Here's one that we call the moral argument. And this is the idea that humans, we intuitively know that there is right and wrong, objective moral value. In other words, it's not based on your opinion and my opinion. It's a right and wrong that we all know exists that is beyond us. Okay, now, an objective system of morality that is above humanity cannot have been made by humanity. So by implication, there would have to be a moral being above humanity that created morality. And this is what we call the moral argument. So notice, for example, there'd be no such thing, if atheism is true, there'd be no such thing as right and wrong. There would be objectively right and wrong for everybody. Richard Dawkins, in his book, The God Delusion, said absolutist moral discrimination is devastatingly undermined by the fact of evolution. Because if evolution is true, there wouldn't be absolute morality. There can't be real right and wrong that is wrong or right for everybody at every location and every time. William Provine, 1998, professor of evolutionary biology at Cornell, he laid out several undeniable implications of atheism in a speech he gave. And notice number 3, according to the naturalistic evolutionary model, no ultimate foundation for ethics exists. And notice also that he said that Charles Darwin understood that perfectly when he was developing his version of evolution, keeping in mind he really wasn't the one to originate evolution. It's been around for thousands of years. But here's what Darwin said in his autobiography. A man who has no assured and ever-present belief in the existence of a personal God or of a future existence with retribution and reward can have for his rule of life, as far as I can see, only to follow those impulses and instincts which are the strongest or which seem to him the best ones. So according to Darwin, pure naturalism, which would imply atheism, implies that there is no set moral standard, there's no right and wrong, there's only opinion and impulses. French existentialist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre said, everything is indeed permitted if God does not exist. So if there is no God, there's no higher being that can give absolute law that everyone is subject to. There's just opinions. There may be people stronger that can enforce their opinions on other people, but it is still ultimately opinions. Now, atheists have trouble really sticking to this idea that there's no such thing as morality that is above mankind whenever they're confronted with terrible things going on in the world. But they have trouble sticking to holding to this idea because we all know there are some things that are just too heinous not to consider to be objectively wrong. We especially know it when it happens to us. So Dan Barker is a pretty notorious atheist and debater. He wrote the book Godless, in which Richard Dawkins wrote the foreword. Co-president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation. Kyle Butt, that works with me at Apologetics Press, debated him back in 2009. And during the Q&A portion, he asked Dan Barker if it would be acceptable to rape a girl if it would save humanity from some alien race. And so watch him stumble over himself trying to stay consistent with his position in atheism in the face of real evil. He said it'd be horrible, it'd be regrettable, I'd hate myself. I'd probably kill myself after doing it. But I would have the courage if that was the only option. If that were the only option, then I would go through with it. I'd pity that woman, I'd pity myself. But morality would require me to take the course of action that results in the least amount of harm. And those of you whose lives that I save by doing that, you might be disgusted at what I did, but you'd be alive rather than dead. So in that weird situation, which is hypothetical and extreme and would never happen, there are cases where what we think are right and wrong could be flipped around. But notice he thinks there's still right and wrong there. Kyle proceeded to ask him, well, okay, would you rape 2 women? How about 2,000? Would it be okay to rape 2 million women? And Barker said to save 6 billion? Yes, it would be, because otherwise you've got 6 billion deaths. Are you telling me we should not do what is morally necessary to do to minimize harm? And so notice atheists can't really help but talk about morality as though they're objective. Everybody knows these things. But there can't be anything that is morally necessary if there is no moral law higher than man. Now, it doesn't matter what culture or setting a person grows up in. We understand from a young age, even if we haven't been taught about it, that there's some things that are right, there's some things that are wrong. We know that it isn't right if another person comes and takes something from us that's not theirs, if it was mine. If I didn't give it to him and he comes and takes it from me, we don't even have to be taught that. We just know it. That's not fair, is the term we'll say. We know even if we're three, if we steal a cookie and our brother steals a cookie and we get in trouble and he doesn't, we know that's not right. It's not just. We all understand it's not fair if we work our whole lives for something and then somebody comes and beats us up and takes it. Right? We know that's not right, even if it's the government doing it, right? So mankind understands this. I mean, we understand if we do a bunch of work writing a paper and somebody comes and takes it and plagiarizes it, says it's their own and goes and makes $1 million off of it or something, that's not right. Now, we may accept these things and say, oh, well, that's just the way of the world, move on. But the point is, we all know that's not fair, right? It's wrong, and it's not opinion to say that. Injustice is objectively wrong. We understand within us that there's a higher law that governs everybody about fairness, about justice, that's above humans and not subject to our opinions. But there can't be this higher law code about justice that's above the opinions of humanity without there being a lawmaker that wrote this moral law code. So objective morality illustrates there must be a God, and that is the moral argument. Concerning the fact that we intuitively understand fairness and justice, we seem to have a built-in program that governs us about these things. It's interesting to note the fact that in the Bible, the English words translated as righteous and just are translated interchangeably with each other from their underlying Greek and Hebrew words. In Hebrew, it's tzaddik, and it can be translated righteous or just. In Greek, it's dikaios. Again, it can be translated as righteous or just. So the implication seems to be that what is right and wrong comes down to what is just or fair. That's what it's all really about. The fact that we've been programmed with this fairness meter within us, that we have a program that can be used to determine right and wrong in many cases, which that indicates that there must be a right and wrong that humans didn't make up. It's programmed into us, it's not developed by us. So the minute a person admits that there are things that are objectively unfair for everyone, he's admitting to the existence of objective moral value, a higher set of standards which could only have been instituted by a higher being. And in so doing, he is rejecting atheism. How about the intuitional argument? Humans are incurably religious. Our intuition tells us there's a God. And this seems to be common sense to humans, as though we've been programmed to be theists. According to adherents.com, some 92% of the world believes that there's something beyond the purely physical, and 86% are worshiping something. The rest are arguably worshiping themselves and each other. This isn't something the animals do, but humans seem to have been built with a desire to worship something. And atheism can't really explain this apparent instinctive tendency of humanity. Michael Shermer admitted, we perceive nature to be intelligently designed. Came out and admitted that. Since the most common reason people give for why they believe in God is the good design of the world, intelligent design creationists are tapping into the intuitive understanding most people hold about life and the universe. Richard Dawkins said, it's almost as if the human brain were specifically designed to find Darwinism hard to believe. He says, why, if it is false, does every culture in the world have religion? True or false, religion is ubiquitous. So where does it come from, he says. Psychologists Paul Bloom and Dina Weisberg of Yale and University of Pennsylvania respectively, said there is by now a large body of research suggesting that humans are natural-born creationists, right? As though it's just built into us. When we see non-random structure and design, we assume that it was created by an intelligent being. We have to be untaught about this. It already seems to be in us to be theists. So geneticist Dean Hamer even wrote a book called The God Gene, where he acknowledged humans seem to be hardwired to be religious And he was trying to figure out maybe, how do we explain this from a naturalistic perspective? Maybe there's actual genes involved. So this religious inclination of humanity, they say, this is a problem. They're trying to figure out why would it be the case that everybody tends to be inherently religious. Why is this a problem? Well, Richard Dawkins explains religion is so wasteful, so extravagant, and Darwinian selection habitually targets and eliminates waste. So why wouldn't it have? Famous atheistic philosopher Daniel Dennett expounds on the problem of costly religion. The world, he says, is populated by billions of people, almost all of whom devote a significant fraction of their time and energy to some sort of religious activity. Rituals such as daily prayer, both public and private, or frequent attendance at ceremonies, but also costly sacrifices, not working on certain days no matter what looming crisis needs prompt attention, and abiding by a host of strenuously observed prohibitions and requirements. If evolution were true, then why wasn't religion eliminated? Humans engage in this costly endeavor that should have worked against us from an evolutionary perspective, not moved us to the apex point on the evolutionary chain. It should have caused the ultimate demise of humans. Evolutionists are going to great lengths to try to figure this out. Dawkins irrationally proposed the idea that, and I say irrational because remember the law of rationality says one should only draw conclusions warranted by the evidence. There's no evidence for what he's proposed. He's irrationally proposed that religion may be something like a virus that's infecting humanity, and it's been passed down genetically through what he calls memes that he's totally made up. And the idea is that theism is like a virus and it's trying to replicate itself for its own survival through evangelism. Now, of course, even if that were true, why couldn't the argument be flipped around and used against the atheistic perspective? Now, the bottom line is there's no evidence for this. Humanity seems to have been built to be religious, and even the scientific studies are coming out and acknowledging that. And it makes no sense from an evolutionary perspective. Our natural inclination to believe that there's something above us that we're beholden to and should worship is evidence that such a being exists that put that instinct in us. And I think that's what's being alluded to here in Acts 17, where Paul says, remember to the individuals on Mars Hill, and he, God, has made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on all the face of the earth. Right? So God has made all man so that they should seek the Lord. He made man in such a way that they would seek him in the hope that they might grope for him and find him, though he's not far from each one of us. Right? So he gave us this instinct to search for him, and then he made sure that the evidence is not that far from anybody that really does go ahead and grope for him and try to find him, because he's not far. In him we live and move and have our being. God made us with this desire. Human intuition indicates God exists. What about the aesthetic argument? The fact that beauty exists and that we have been given the capability of appreciating this. Now, atheism can't adequately explain beauty, because that appreciation for beauty, by and large, has no evolutionary advantage. And this highlights the fact that a God exists that cares for his creation, a benevolent God, and wants to give us joy and pleasure. Now, Darwin recognized this argument as a threat in The Origin of Species. He said this: some authors believe that many structures have been created for the sake of beauty, to delight man or the Creator, or for the sake of mere variety. Such doctrines, if true, would be absolutely fatal to my theory. Well, why is that? Well, because evolution can't explain how something would become beautiful for the sole benefit of others. Because evolution is survival of the fittest. It's the selfish battle of strong for survival. It's not about others. So evolving a trait has to have a selfish benefit, not the benefit of others. So what his idea was, well, maybe beauty wasn't created, it just accidentally evolved and then stuck around, for example, in the beautiful male creatures, the beautiful birds and so forth, because that beauty benefited those creatures in getting mates. While, so what we call sexual selection. So the ugly animals didn't get those mates, and so they tend to die out. You think that plays out in reality? You see a lot of ugly, creatures out there. Now, the problem is, number one, Darwin, his natural selection idea only helps explain the survival of the fittest, not the arrival of the fittest. Evolution has no answer for how those creatures could have evolved beauty in the first place. The accidental creation of beauty that was then appealing to mates. There is no known evolutionary mechanism for the generation of new information in the genome. Mutations have been shown to not provide that. But new information would be needed to create beauty where there once was no beauty. But also notice that natural selection doesn't explain why we have an innate appreciation for beauty in the first place. Why do we get joy and pleasure and happiness merely from hearing beautiful music from an orchestra or seeing a waterfall or sunset? You know, in fact, we even have, we see beauty in things that are dangerous to us. Now, natural selection might explain why something beautiful tends to stick around, but it doesn't explain why we would see that thing as beautiful in the first place. Why do we have an appreciation for beauty? And therein lies the argument for the existence of a loving God. He's made everything beautiful in its time, Ecclesiastes 3:11. Things that are pleasant for the eyes, Ecclesiastes 11:7. The ontological argument's another one, and there's lots of varieties of this one. It's kind of a complicated argument, so we don't tend to see it as much. But the general idea is that we can't conceive of qualities, characteristics that don't exist in some being. Okay, so if you were to make up something in your mind that you've never seen, it is still composed of things that you know exist. So you make up any kind of creature, you know, a four-headed dragon with snakes for legs and fire coming out of its nostrils or whatever is his eye sockets. The creature is still composed of things you know exist. Head, snakes, fire, eyes. You can't come up with anything totally new that's comprised of qualities you don't know exist. So Star Trek and Star Wars characters, all composed of qualities that we know exist. You can't really come up with anything totally new. The ontological argument says you can't conceive of these qualities that don't exist in some being, and we can conceive of superlative characteristics. Omniscience, omnipotence, omnipresence, omnibenevolence, and so forth, indicating that those must exist in some being. Someone says, well, is this just an imaginary creature that has these imaginary characteristics? So we can reason through this. If a characteristic is just imagined, and we just made this being up that has these superlative creatures or characteristics, it wouldn't be superlative. It wouldn't be the greatest. Because what would be greater? Well, if that characteristic really was real, not just imagined, that would make it greater. A real characteristic is superlative over an imagined one, and we can conceive of real superlative characteristics proving those qualities must exist in some being. And that is the thrust of that argument. There's one of my favorites, the cosmological argument, which has a lot more science involved in this one. The cosmos is here, the universe exists. It had to come from somewhere. Remember Job 38, God lays out the thrust of this argument. He asks Job about the creation of the earth, the universe, where did it come from? Who created it? Who laid the foundation of the earth? Who determined its measurements, he said? Who stretched the line upon it and laid its cornerstone? So the universe exists, and it demands an ultimate cause. There has to be a reason, a cause for the universe. Now, cause and effect is fundamental to science. This is what science is all about, determining the effects of various causes and the causes of various effects. Now, if we want to be rational, and then we want to accept the evidence if it demands a certain conclusion. And the evidence says the law of cause and effect, or the law of causality, governs the universe in every situation we've ever seen. In paraphrasing, it basically says if you have an effect, there must logically be a cause. More precisely, every material effect, everything that we've ever observed in the physical universe, must have an adequate antecedent or simultaneous cause. And so the cause has to precede, that is, come before the effect, or it can occur at the same time as the effect. And it has to have the necessary potential, the necessary power to create the effect. So all natural effects must have causes. So we know that in nature, an effect has a cause. The planets exist. They're floating through space. They're spinning. These are effects. life exists, living things. These are effects. There must be an adequate cause for these. And ultimately, there is none without a God in the picture. There has to be an ultimate creator of these things. The mere existence of the cosmos is proof of the existence of a supernatural being that caused it. So how does the naturalist deal with this conundrum today? So what cause does the naturalist point to try to explain the existence of the universe without a creator? Well, the general consensus today in the scientific community is that the origin of the universe can be explained from a massive explosion type event, really just a rapid expansion of an extremely hot, tiny, dense ball of material billions of years ago that we call the Big Bang Theory. Now, even if that were true, of course, we ask, where did the little ball come from, so to speak? So if you're a naturalist, you don't accept God, you've only got two options. It's either self-created, right, what we call spontaneous generation, so it created itself, or it is self-existent. That is, it's eternal. It's always been here. So let's consider the first option, and we want to be rational. So let's look at what the actual evidence says on this and not have a blind faith. So let's say there's an invisible box around the universe. It's a boundary layer that's big enough to hold the entire universe in it. So if you believe that the universe could just spontaneously generate, just pop into existence on its own from nothing, then in a thermodynamic sense, you believe that this box, the universe box, was initially completely empty. So let's zoom inside of the box. So the box is empty, we're inside of it. The spontaneous generation model idea, which is what is accepted by the bulk of the scientific community today, that it argues that no one put matter and energy in the universe, it put itself there. So according to this model, you can stand around inside of this box and stare into nothingness, and given enough time, all of a sudden, ta-da, something can just appear. And not only could something just come into existence, but according to this version of the model, a little ball containing all of the matter and energy of the entire universe can just come into existence. And then, so they say, for some reason, the Big Bang process starts. You've got an inflationary event where things are moving faster than the speed of light. Nobody knows how that can happen. Nobody knows why it would happen, why, and what would stop it. But it must happen in order to fix the horizon and flatness problems. The Big Bang has major problems, according to their own leading cosmologists. But they just blindly believe that it happened anyway, without evidence, no evidence for it. Eventually, given enough time, the universe expands, life pops into existence, somehow, gradually evolves over time, and then, ta-da, finally you show up in the universe. This is what is accepted by the bulk of the cosmological community, in spite of the major problems scientifically with this model. Well, there's problems with this, and one of them comes in the form of what we call the first law of thermodynamics. There's a lot of laws of science, but some laws we call super laws, because other laws are based on these. These are so fundamental to the universe. And the laws of thermodynamics are like that. These are super laws. First law of thermodynamics is summarized by this evolutionist. Energy can be neither created nor destroyed, but can only be converted from one form to another. We also call this the law of conservation of matter and energy. Now, what does this mean practically speaking? Well, have you ever thought about what happened to a log of wood when you burned it? Where did all the stuff go? So obviously the pile of ash alone can't account for all of it. So where did it go? Did it disappear from the universe? In other words, was it destroyed? Not according to the first law of thermodynamics. First law says that in any process we've ever seen in the universe, like wood burning, matter and energy can change into other forms while it's burning, like heat, light, ash. But the sum total amount of energy that was in the universe before you burned it is the same as the amount of energy in the universe after you burn it. Energy hasn't disappeared or been destroyed from the universe, and energy hasn't popped into existence in the process either. So using more technical terminology, first law of thermodynamics says that in any kind of system, and this can work in a closed or an open system, but in our case, we're looking at a closed system because we've got a box that has the whole universe in it. There's nothing outside of the box. That's the point. Only nature exists if you're a naturalist, if you're an atheist. So there's no energy coming into the system or leaving the system. That makes it a closed system. Well, the sum total amount of energy within the boundaries of that system will remain constant. So as this chart shows, the amount of energy present before any process that we've ever witnessed in the universe must be the same as the amount of energy present after the process. So guess what? If you start with nothing in the box, what are you going to have after any process? Well, there's not going to be a process, right? This isn't rocket science. This is not complicated. Things don't create themselves according to the first law of thermodynamics. And remember, there's no exceptions to this. So by implication, it would be unscientific. It would go against the laws of science. If anything can be said to be scientific, it'd be the laws of science, wouldn't it? Especially the super laws. It would be unscientific to believe that matter and energy could come into being in such a way that the first law of thermodynamics was violated. And it would be irrational to just reject that and just blindly believe that it can happen anyway, which is what the scientific community is doing, being irrational about this. Why? Because they don't want God. That's why. It's not about it. We're not following the evidence here to the logical conclusion. According to the first law, the only way that matter can appear inside of that box is if it was put there from outside of the box. That's what the first law tells us. So according to the evidence, the first option for the atheist doesn't fit the evidence. Matter couldn't have spontaneously generated or popped into existence. What about the second option? This used to be more popular several decades ago, and it's fallen on hard times, not accepted by as many cosmologists now. But could the universe have always existed? That's basically what we're looking at here. So this model would claim the universe has always been inside of this box. No one put it here. It's just always been there, either moving through space forever, expanding, or if you believe in the oscillating universe model, you'd believe the universe operates in a cycle where you have a collapse, and then another big bang, and an expansion, and then a collapse, another big expansion, over and over like a big cosmic accordion, repeating forever. So either way, this model would say that the stuff of the universe has always been here. It is eternal. Well, well-known atheist, physicist, cosmologist, and astrobiologist Paul Davies, writing in New Scientist, he's actually an Arizona State University guy, he said this: the celebrated second law of thermodynamics says, roughly speaking, that in any change, the universe becomes a slightly more disorderly place. The entropy goes up, the information content goes down. This natural tendency towards disintegration and chaos is evident all around us. What are the implications of that? Well, in a technical sense, the second law builds on the first law and says that although the same amount of energy is present after any process, some of that energy will transform into a less usable form of energy. And we call this entropy. And it's an irreversible process. It only goes in one direction. So any kind of process we've ever seen in the universe, this is the way it goes. Now what this means, practically speaking, is that everything is wearing out. It's decaying. All right? So the universe is running down. We're running out of usable energy. And as Paul Davies said, we can see this idea everywhere, can't we? Does a car get nicer over time? Wouldn't it be nice if you could go down to the junkyard and get a clunker and just stare at it and wait, and eventually it'll turn into this perfect Ferrari or something like that? Okay, well, we know that's not going to happen because of the second law of thermodynamics. It's really going to keep getting worse. That's what's going to happen. Kids, wouldn't it be nice if your room got cleaner just on its own? No matter what you did, it just got cleaner. I mean, you could try to make it dirty. Wouldn't it be nice, dads, if your house's paint job just got nicer on its own? You know, I thought about marketing a shirt called Entropy Fighter, because that's really so much of what a dad's job is. It's just to fight constantly entropy in our houses, and spiritual entropy too. Entropy is like, anyway, they'll get me going on that. But everything's wearing out, and we see this everywhere. So returning to our wood burning example, when the wood burns, all of the energy that was present before it burned is still present, according to the first law of thermodynamics. According to the second law of thermodynamics, much of that energy is transformed into less usable forms, yes, less retrievable forms, like heat. And after that heat dissipates, you're essentially left with a pile of ash, which of course isn't nearly as usable. So again, just like the first law, the second law has no exceptions. It's never been broken. Notice what this thermodynamics textbook says. To date, no experiment has been conducted that contradicts the second law, and this should be taken as sufficient proof of its validity. If you're being rational, if you're following the evidence where it leads. All right, now what does this mean concerning the origins question? Well, it means the universe couldn't have always existed if we still have usable energy. So according to the second law of thermodynamics, if the universe is infinite in age, then we shouldn't have any usable energy. Everything should be totally broken down. We should be at a state of heat death. And yet, of course, we have an abundant amount of usable energy in harmony with the idea that the universe isn't actually super old. Now, notice that the biblical creation model is in harmony with these laws of thermodynamics. For example, the creation model predicts decay and a gradual loss of usable energy, as the second law states. So according to the creation model, the universe is not going to last forever. It's going to grow old and deteriorate. Hebrews 1, quoting from Psalm 102, written 3,000 years ago, before we even articulated the second law of thermodynamics in the 1800s, said, "You, Lord, in the beginning laid the foundation of the earth, and the heavens are the work of your hands. They will perish, but you remain, and they will all grow old like a garment. Like a cloak, you will fold them up, and they will be changed. But you are the same, and your years will not fail." So again, according to the laws of science, specifically the first and second laws of thermodynamics, which have no exceptions, the spontaneous generation of matter and energy could not have happened. Matter cannot be eternal. And those are the only two options for how naturalistic evolution, for how atheism could happen. So the evolutionary model is not possible. So that leaves some form of creation. And on top of that, the biblical creation model is supported by both the first and second laws because both of these are articulated in Scripture. And I go into this much more in depth in my Science versus Evolution book. So if we were to stick with the scientific evidence rather than just blindly accepting what naturalists have been shoving down everybody's throat for decades now, the evidence points to a creator. And that is the cosmological argument. The universe is here, couldn't create itself. Logically, it requires an ultimate cause, a creator. What about the teleological argument? This is of interest particularly to engineers. This is something engineers study, design. Atheistic philosopher and professor Paul Ricci said, it's true that everything designed has a designer, right? So that statement really summarizes the concept here of the teleological argument. If you can find evidence of design in the universe, there had to be, by implication, a universe designer. Now, atheists like Ricci generally admit that basic truth. Now, they generally will refuse to admit the existence of design in the universe. I believe very irrationally when you examine this without bias. But they concede if you really could find design, okay, there'd have to be a designer. You can't have a poem without there being a poet, right? A painting requires a painter or an artist, yeah, same thing. It's interesting. I rarely do I get people using other words for these. A fingerprint requires a finger, all right. Usually people don't get that one. They'll say a hand or something. So this is complicated stuff, right? So does the universe contain the characteristic of design? Just standing back and letting the evidence point us in a direction. There's an infinite number of examples that logically point to the conclusion there would be a designer, which is why, for example, notice what Michael Shermer said. The design inference comes naturally. The reason people think that a designer created the world is because it looks designed. In other words, we're not being idiots about this. We're being logical. He doesn't want to accept that. But that doesn't mean it's not logical. It actually looks designed. We perceive nature to be intelligently designed. Oh, just blindly? No. Based on our experience of human artifacts. We know some human artifacts are intelligently designed because we've observed them being made, and we have vast experience with human artificers. So he actually comes out and admits we're not actually being idiots to be believers in a designer. It's logical when we study the evidence. Remember this statement: since the most common reason people give for why they believe in God is the good design of the world, intelligent design creationists are tapping into the intuitive understanding most people hold about life and the universe. Notice it's intuitive for us to believe in a designer. let's just look at, I mean, we could look at this for multiple sessions, but let's just look at a couple interesting examples of what I mean by this. One of the amazing thermal systems that God created is the human biothermal system. This is one of the things that I studied in school. This is the system that oversees how our bodies respond to temperature fluctuations. So temperature changes in our environment and in our bodies. And your body does this through this very sophisticated thermoregulatory system. This is the system that helps to regulate your temperature. So let's look at just a couple details about this sophisticated system. This could be an entire session too. The entire temperature system for your body, as you might expect, is controlled by your brain, and the processing center in the brain that controls the biothermal system is what we call the hypothalamus, and this is basically the thermostat for your body's air conditioning system. And so it's controlling the thermoregulatory system. And the body uses temperature sensors like thermometers, thermocouples in engineering, and we call these thermoreceptors. And these sensors are located strategically in just the right places in your body to read the temperature wherever they are. They're in the hypothalamus, they're in your skin, they're in your bladder, they're even in your eyes. And the thermoreceptors in your skin are the peripheral nerves, and they're detecting changes in the external temperature, so temperature change in the air. The thermoreceptors in the hypothalamus are actually checking your blood's temperature. And from all this temperature information, the hypothalamus has to know what to do. How does it know what to do? Well, it has to be able to adjust the body's functions. And how's it going to do that? Well, amazingly, there are these what we call effector nerves that are like power lines that are used to communicate with all the various parts of the body to initiate just the right kind of responses to temperature somehow. Very sophisticated system that shows planning, intention, not random accidents, and it's not illogical to draw this conclusion. So let's look at just one interesting little example of what your hypothalamus is doing all the time. The bladder's detrusor muscle. There's thermoreceptors in your bladder that are taking the temperature of the liquid therein and sending this temperature information to the hypothalamus using these power lines, the effector nerves. And as the temperature of the bladder drops due to getting cold, a bladder cooling reflex is triggered in the hypothalamus. A message is sent down to the detrusor muscle for some reason, somehow randomly, urging the detrusor muscle to contract, which makes you feel the urge to go get that cool liquid out of your body to keep your body's core temperature regulated. All right, now how did that just happen by accident again? And how could someone even have the knowledge to come up with this sophisticated system? The muscle, the sensors, the nerves connecting the bladder to the hypothalamus. How helpful would an effector nerve that only went halfway be? Didn't it have to be all the way intact from the beginning, logically? Okay, are you an ignorant hillbilly if you think that way? I don't think so. You have to have a blind faith in atheism for some other reason to reject the logical conclusion here. You know what they'll generally say is, well, it just somehow happens. You just give it enough time. Okay, that's a blind faith, people. That's not logical. That's not rational. The natural order in its complexity and ingenuity are stunning. And in fact, I'm not the only one that believes that. One area of engineering that has been growing by leaps and bounds for decades is what we call biomimicry, as well as bio-inspired engineering. Biomimicry is where engineers are using nature as their blueprint to design things, and they're just trying to copy it. I just read something else this week about this. The webpage for George Washington University's Center for Biomimetics and Bio-Inspired Engineering says this: however, despite our seeming prowess in these component technologies, despite how awesome we seem to be as engineers, we find it hard to outperform nature in this arena. Nature solutions are smarter, more energy efficient, agile, adaptable, fault tolerant, environmentally friendly, and multifunctional. Thus, there's much that we as engineers can learn from nature as we develop the next generation machines and technologies. So notice the leading engineering minds are bowing to the superior design that they're finding in the universe around us. And they're saying, we can't mimic this. We can't, what's the word? We can't match this. We can't do what nature's doing. We got to try to copy what it is, because we can't come up with something as good as what nature's already doing somehow. Here's a single example. Engineers are more and more coming to the realization insects function amazingly well when you consider the fact that their brains carry 0.01% as many neurons as do human brains. And yet their ability to maneuver, like some of these flying insects, we can't equal this in engineering, like what these creatures can do. And one of the insect features that engineers discovered is that many of these flying insects are equipped with a sophisticated engineering sensor that helps these insects keep track of their orientation, where they can stay upright while they're flying in the air. Ocelli are small eyes located on the heads of various kinds of insects that are in addition to those big, larger compound eyes that you usually think of as the eyes, but these ocelli are also on some of these creatures' bodies. And engineers believe that these ocelli are horizon sensors that are dedicated to that purpose. They locate the horizon to help the insect keep track of its orientation when it's doing all these complicated maneuvers where it could get confused about which way is up and down. So with these ocelli in mind, engineers started trying to mimic these horizon sensors in developing aerial vehicles. So engineers from Caltech and Australian National University, in association with NASA, developed a biomorphic ocellus, mimicking the ocelli of dragonflies in order to achieve, they say, an improved flight stabilization system for aerial vehicles. So when engineers engage in this kind of design, they're acknowledging the awesomeness of the natural realm and the presence of design in the universe, whether or not they mean to. It's illogical to say, well, evolution just accidentally caused these things. Just blindly saying that, how exactly can you get these things to occur that require already being intact and functioning from the moment of their existence? It's logical to say, oh, there's got to be a designer. There's an engineer behind this, obviously. Many, many other powerful examples of design we could look at. This just gives you a very small taste of the evidence on this. When you think about the complexion of our world around us, we have nearly 2 billion people now that are Muslim, over 1 billion Hindus, over 1 billion now that are irreligious. These are atheists and others, infidels and so forth. Over 2 billion that profess Christianity in general. About half of those are Catholic. And yet Christians are required to be ready to give a defense to everyone, right? Which is what Glenn was reading there from 1 Peter 3:15. God expects Christians to be apologists. That's the word that underlies this phrase, give a defense, apologion. He expects us to be able to do that. Whenever people challenge our faith, we need to be ready to reason with them about it. It's not a blind faith. The solution isn't to say, well, you just have to feel. No, that's not a biblical idea. We have to be ready to actually give a defense of the things we believe. That means logical reasoning. Be ready in season and out of season. In fact, he says in Ezekiel 3, when I say to the wicked, you shall surely die, and you give him no warning, nor speak to warn the wicked from his wicked way to save his life, well, that same wicked man shall die in his iniquity, but his blood I'll require at your hand. Yet if you warn the wicked, and he doesn't turn from his wickedness, nor from his wicked way, he shall die in his iniquity, but you've delivered your soul. And we're expected to be ready to deal with the attacks that are being made on Christianity by atheism and naturalism. That is, about a quarter of our country now accepts pure naturalism, right? I mean, so theism is going down quickly in our country. And so these are the kind of things we're talking about in this session. These are the kind of things we got to be ready to talk to people about. And if we're going to actually defend what the Bible has to say on any given number of topics, and I'm thankful for the organization that I work at Apologetics Press. We're a nonprofit organization. And I would argue that Christians would be hard-pressed to find time to be able to respond to be able to study, to be able to respond to all of the crazy ideas that are out there today. And so Apologetics Press exists with the purpose of doing a lot of that research and study for you, packaging it for you in a way where you can take these things and use them not only just for your own faith, but bolstering the faith of those around you and defending your faith. That's the purpose of this. And so those that do the writing for the material that we put out all have graduate level degrees in the various relevant areas of our studies in order to give you top-notch materials. We try to stay on top of the latest things that are going on to give you the kind of information you need in order to defend your faith. And so brought a lot of materials back there, some of which are for purchase. There's a table of free things as well. Ton of material on our website. Be sure to check that out this weekend. I'll be talking some about the materials a little bit here and there throughout the weekend to kind of help you to see what I have back there so that you can determine whether this is something you need for your library, whether you know somebody that needs these things. So be thinking that way this weekend. The elders put a lot of money into getting this stuff shipped here so that you can have this at your fingertips. So be sure to check that out this weekend. All right, we are going to take a brief break before we have our second session. Remember, the next rung on our tower we're building is, well, now that we know God exists, how do we know that it's the God of the Bible? And how do we know the Bible's inspired? So that's what we're going to look at briefly in this next session that will begin in about 10 minutes. Glenn, you want me to just turn them loose? All right, so let's plan to be back in 10 minutes. Thank you for your attention.
let you talk to him. I'm glad you clarified.
We good? There we go. Can you hear me? All right. Okay. This is a fun session. And tomorrow we'll get to start getting into the creation model, Genesis 1 through 11, and real excited about that. Yeah, I spent a lot of time in your neck of the woods up here in northern Arizona, and hope to get to talk to you about some of that as well. Really would it would be neat for you all to get to come to some of the stuff that I do up there, where I kind of show you what's going on with some of those sites up there from the perspective of the flood. And we'll get to touch on that tomorrow in one of our sessions. But I especially would love it if any of your teens that you know of could be part of what I'm doing up there, where I'm teaching a course where they can get high school and even dual enrollment college credit through Freed-Hardeman to come and learn about physical science and the flood up there in northern Arizona. Wouldn't that have been cool as a kid to get to do that? So it's been very faith building for these young people. We just finished up. It was 2 weeks ago we got back from doing a couple of those in northern Arizona there. But that's not the topic of this session. All right, so we looked at a sampling of evidence that points to the existence of God. And we've got so much material at Apologetics Press on this topic. We've got a book called Does God Exist? That goes into this more in depth. We have a whole section of our website devoted to this as well, including responding to the arguments people give to push back on any of these things. So lots of material on this that you could go down a rabbit hole and stay there for weeks if you'd like to. All right. Now, a few decades ago in our country, really the matter would have been closed at this point. You show evidence that God exists. Everybody knows it's the God of the Bible, but that's not where we're at now, because we've had decades now of pluralism shoved down our throat. Where now what I'm getting a lot of people that'll say, well, okay, let's say God does exist. How do you know that it is the God of the Bible? How do you know which God exists? How do you know that it's not Allah or Buddha? And how could anybody even come to know which God exists if you were born and raised in some far-off non-Christian country that outlaws Bibles, outlaws Christian thinking? All right, so let's think about these things and reason about these in this session. First of all, I would immediately disagree with a scenario from a biblical perspective where somebody would be in a situation where they would not be able to get access to Bibles and so forth. We know that God's providence is going to allow anyone that is hungering and thirsting for righteousness to be filled. Anyone that is seeking, you're going to be able to find, right? Matthew 5:6, Matthew 7:7 through 8. Now that said, we can certainly envision scenarios where people maybe are born in a non-Christian home and they just don't really have a ready access to a Bible or Christian discussion and thinking. How can people come to know that the God of the Bible is the one true God? Now, the first response to this can be found without even having a Bible, just by having the reasoning and thinking capabilities that we have as humans. Without even opening a Bible, there are some things that you can learn about the Creator, whoever it is, by studying the things that are made. Remember in Romans 1:20. We can look at the things that are made and come to some conclusions about God, that He has eternal power, and we can learn about His Godhead and so forth from this. Now, so the things that we look at in nature around us can tell us some information about the Creator. Can you learn something about a clothes designer from the clothes that he or she designs? You know, let's say they're immodest or gaudy. Does that say anything about a clothes designer? Can you learn anything about, say, an engineer by studying a car that was designed by the engineer? Maybe it's very environmentally friendly, or maybe it's very fast or strong. Can you learn something about a parent by his children? You know, the values that a parent has or doesn't have, right? Now, obviously, you can't learn everything about a person that way, but you can learn some things. So it would stand to reason that you could learn some things about the Creator from studying the things that are made, and then compare those qualities with the qualities of the supposed gods of the earth and start eliminating false gods. Now, that's not always going to be easy. Of course, you're sifting through evidence to try to determine what really characterizes the Creator. So we would say from a Christian perspective, we know things today are not what they were originally, the way God originally created it. Satan has been at work corrupting things. Humans have made a mess along the way. And yet Romans 1:20 is still written thousands of years after all that began, and it still says you can learn some things about God by looking at the things that are made. In fact, not knowing these things, he says, is without excuse. So we can look at the created order and learn about the Creator. So let's, for example, somebody comes along and says, I think really the Bible has deceived us on this. It's really backwards. Satan, the Satan of the Bible, is actually the Creator, not God. All right, well, we can test that. Okay, any person who's lived in the world for very long and knows about the Satan of the Bible should be immediately skeptical of that claim, because we see too many things in creation that don't fit with Satan being the Creator. Thousands upon thousands of blessings and joys and happiness and freedom to believe that a holy, selfish, unloving, uncaring being would create an environment like that. So we can rule out Satan as the Creator. And so notice we can look at the created order and eliminate certain concepts about the Creator by studying the creation. And the primary question, of course, is going to be, can the characteristics of a suggested God be harmonized with what we see in nature? Are there inconsistencies that can't be resolved with the nature of the God that is being hypothesized by a particular religion? So even if the inconsistency is resolved, it still doesn't necessarily mean that God is the true God, but it at least helps to start eliminating those gods that can't harmonize with the evidence. And notice, this is something anybody in any country can do. They can use their ability to reason and compare the God or gods of their family to what they see around them to see if it even makes sense. And amazingly, some gods humans come up with don't even claim to have the characteristics that is implied by the created order about the Creator. They just don't match up in obvious ways. So let's think about the Creator of the universe. What can we learn about the Creator from examining the universe, essentially by observational science? Number one, the Creator has to be all-powerful. What do we mean by that? Well, this being had to have the strength to create everything from nothing and then place it strategically in just the right places after creating it, which implies an infinity to this being. Okay, so in other words, this being has to be able to do anything that requires power to do. Power as we define it here in our universe. So any God who isn't all-powerful is not the Creator. Buddhism, interestingly, doesn't claim an omnipotent God. And neither do the Greek and Roman gods of mythology. The God of the Bible claims to be omnipotent. He can do anything which can rationally be done. All-knowing. When you think about knowledge, think about going through school starting out from a young age, and you're 5 years old in kindergarten, and you're learning a little bit about a lot of things. And you notice as you go on in school, you start learning more about fewer things. And you get to high school and you're picking particular classes and learning more about these. You go to college, you pick a general discipline and you learn a lot about that. If you go to graduate school, you're learning even more about a smaller amount. If you go to the PhD level, the doctoral level, you're supposed to have learned more than anybody on one little thing that nobody else has studied that for. Now, interestingly, the Creator had to already know that because He created that thing you're studying. And in fact, every other thing in the entire universe. This implies an infinite knowledge, knowing everything about the entire universe because He created every speck of it. All right, and again, the Buddhism doesn't claim an omniscient God. It believes there cannot be omniscience. And the Greek and Roman gods can't claim omniscience either. Again, the God of the Bible claims to be omniscient. He knows all, 1 John 3:20. How about all present? So this being has to be large enough in order to be able to place things that are billions of light years away. And we're not even talking about just spatially big. This being has to even be in the future and in the past, because this being had to create time. So he's not even bound by time. It helps us to fathom how he can know the future so perfectly. He's already there. So Buddhism, again, doesn't claim an omnipresent God. The God of the Bible claims to be omnipresent. Psalm 139, 7 through 10, he's everywhere. The eyes of the Lord are in every place, keeping watch on the evil and the good. God will remember every work into judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil. It also describes him as not just everywhere, but every when. 1 Timothy 1, 16 and 17, he's eternal, immortal. The words I am are used throughout the Bible to denote Jehovah. It's not I was or will be. It's I am, implying he's ever present, omnipresent. He is, was, and is to come, Revelation 1, 8. This Creator is fair, just, unbiased, unprejudiced. All right, let's unpack this a little bit. So by looking at the creation, we see that everybody is able to receive blessings. And everybody receives suffering. Everybody has the potential to strive for and achieve desires. It doesn't matter what their gender is, their race, their beauty, power, strength, money, status. Now, the Creator could have made the universe in such a way that only certain people received all the suffering and everybody else received blessing, right? But the Creator made the creation in such a way that anyone has the potential for blessings and curses. Now, humans can step in and tamper with the created order and do things that will cause injustices and suffering for others, and the Creator allows that because of another one of his attributes. So humans might do things that cause advantages or disadvantages, but notice those aren't inherent in the creation itself. Freedom is inherent, which has the potential to cause advantages and disadvantages for humans when we exercise those freedoms. But the Creator chose to create a system where everybody's born with nothing, dies, and leaves all their physical possessions behind. They're in the same place, beginning and ending. The nature of the creation is such that apparently all humans are equal. The founders of our country recognized that. That's why they put it into the Declaration of Independence. This is fundamental to nature. We're equal. A king is not actually of more value than a slave. That's all in our minds, making that up. Those advantages and disadvantages are created by humans, not the Creator. Remember also from our last session, even from a young age, we understand justice and fairness as though it's been programmed into us by the Creator. Fairness seems to be important to the Creator, whoever it is. But notice that there are religions that claim the Creator to be a partial, prejudiced, unfair, biased God. Islam, for example, very sexist towards women, who are treated basically like cattle. Surah 434 says men are in charge of women. Why? Because Allah hath made the one of them to excel the other. Because men are better than women, right? And because they spend of their property for the support of women. So good women are the obedient, guarding in secret that which Allah hath guarded. As for those from whom ye fear rebellion, admonish them and banish them to beds apart. Don't let them sleep with you. And scourge them. Husbands, I wouldn't recommend trying that. And then if they obey you, seek not a way against them. Lo, Allah is ever high, exalted, and great. All right, so can that concept be harmonized with the God of nature? The God of Calvinism shows partiality. Some people will be saved unconditionally, predestined to salvation, regardless of their behavior. They're just granted faith. Others won't. Totally unfair God. Can that be harmonized with what we see in nature? The Creator appears to be just and impartial. Everybody has the ability to receive blessings. Everybody's guaranteed suffering and pain if his laws are violated. And so again, one might bring up quibbles here and there against a certain concept of a God of various religions, and the question becomes, can that concept of God be harmonized with the evidence or not? If I was from another culture, raised in a home where another God is worshipped, would I be able to harmonize what I see in nature about the Creator with this concept of a God? Well, is justice and fairness a characteristic of the God of the Bible? Well, the God of the Bible is described as just and fair, Psalm 7:11. He doesn't show partiality, right? Acts 10:34. He doesn't judge by outward appearance, 1 Samuel 16:7. He's not biased or prejudiced. He's the author of salvation to all who obey him, Hebrews 5:9, whether you're Jew, Greek, slave free, male or female, Galatians 3:28. Any accusation that has been charged against his justice hasn't been able to be sustained once examined critically and fairly. So we can reason through and conclude other things about the Creator as well. And so these kind of characteristics can be seen in creation without even opening a Bible or any book. And they may be difficult to be clearly seen in some instances, again, but there are still shadows of these. And of course, you can't necessarily learn everything there is to learn about the Creator, and definitely not what He expects just by studying His creation. In the same way, you can't learn everything about a poet from a poem, but you can certainly gather evidence. But that evidence that we can glean can be compared to the characteristics of the gods of various religions, and we quickly start to see that they don't line up with the religious claims of any man-made gods. There's inconsistencies. Now, we would reasonably presume only the true Creator is going to line up perfectly. So think through the implications of that. We already saw in the last session that there is this inherent inclination for us to search for God, to grope for Him, right? We're natural-born theists. And we also have the ability to weed out false gods just by reasoning. So people who are born and raised in countries where other religions are bound on them or where they're indoctrinated in those religions, those people still have the ability to reason through and gather evidence that doesn't line up, that would cast doubt on their God and force them to search elsewhere. That's what it would logically do if you're really hungering and thirsting for righteousness, and if you really are seeking, right? Jesus says, you knock on the door, what's going to happen to that door? It's going to be open, right? God guarantees providentially you're going to be able to find the truth if you're really searching. So again, without even opening a Bible, you've got a starting point that'll point you in the direction of a search for the one true God, which ultimately must end in Scripture. Now, a more direct route to this question, which is the route that I'd recommend you take. Several years ago, I was in Russellville, Arkansas, and I was doing, this weekend we're doing my creation seminar. We've got a whole other seminar that's the opposite. It's the evolution seminar, where we dismantle systematically naturalistic evolution. And I was doing that, and there were some biology professors from Arkansas Tech University that showed up to chew on me a little bit. And they came up after one of the sessions, and one of them was an atheist. And so he said, well, let's say you're right, that there is a God. You know, how do you know that it is the God of the Bible? How do you know that it's not the flying spaghetti monster, for all you know? And so the route that I took was this second route in answering the question. We can determine which God is the Creator by studying the materials that claim to be from the Creator to see if they prove themselves to be supernatural. All right, so think through this. One of the endemic characteristics of the created order is the parent-child relationship, right? All life comes from parents, okay? This isn't just among the humans. This is just how life works. And we observe from these relationships the importance of parents in the life of a child. So a good parent doesn't just leave a child to his own devices, whether man or beast. Parents are giving instruction and guidance in some way to keep them safe, help them to know how to be happy. There's this passing of important information. Now, if the Creator saw fit to create such a system, what does that say about the Creator? Wouldn't we conclude that the Creator has tried to communicate with us? He would want to communicate with His creation to guide us, help us to know how to be happy, rather than just hang us out to dry to sink or swim on our own, which is what deists believe, by the way. So that eliminates that concept of God. Well, believe it or not, there's only a handful of materials that even claim to be from the Creator. Did you know that? There's not many. So we should be able to look at those few materials that even claim to be from God and see if they have divine qualities, characteristics that humans couldn't have produced, that only this omniscient being could have created. So again, let's repeat this. This is an important concept that we need to know how to articulate to people. Does this book or material that claims to be from the Creator have qualities or characteristics that are beyond human, right? Divine attributes. Because if humans produce the materials, what do you expect? Right? You expect errors. So error is human. We'd expect contradictions and flaws and inconsistencies. Humans have to put out revised editions because we're prone to mistakes, no matter how meticulous we are. Now, obviously, all of the books that are claiming to be from the Creator can't be true because they give completely contradictory, different teachings and stories about history, for example. All but the true book, therefore, are written by humans that are trying to trick others into following them for power, fame, money, whatever it might be. But if the Creator is the author of something, we've already seen He's all-knowing, He's all-powerful, you'd expect whatever He authored to be flawless in its original form, and also to have things in it that humans just couldn't have known or written. All right, so as an example of how we can determine if humans wrote something and tried to deceive everyone into believing it was from God. So think through this. If the Creator wanted to communicate with mankind today, all right, so He opens up the roof here and He wants to talk to us, would we expect Him to communicate with us using our language? Okay, so if He's writing to 21st century Americans or talking to us, would He use Australian English? I mean, it's a cool accent. Well, one of the things when my dad did mission work down in New Zealand one time, you find out they're speaking English, but it's not exactly the same. They've got some different idioms and so forth that'll get you in trouble. He said, we need to stop piddling around. He said that from the pulpit. That means something different down there. You find out English, there's different dialects on this. Okay, would he use UK English, like United Kingdom? That's different than Australian. When I did my science stuff over there in London, again, I found out these guys speak English, but it's not the same. Would he use English from medieval times? Go back a few hundred years and use that English. Obviously, if the Creator wanted to communicate with mankind, He would communicate with us using our language and dialect. Why? Because He wants us to understand Him. He's going to use our language, right? So when you look at the Bible, for example, that's what you see. The Old Testament, Hebrew and Aramaic, because that was the audience. In the New Testament, it's the Koine Greek that's being used because that was the audience. He wanted to make sure people could understand Him. All right, now, the King James Version translation of the Bible was from 1611. Still a good translation even after 400 years. Now with that in mind, we keep in mind what it is and what it isn't, so that we're not caught off guard by skeptics or deceived like a lot of people have been in the religion I want to talk about for a moment. Isn't it true that languages change a lot in 400 years? Has English changed a little bit in the last 400 years? Sometimes you'll have words, phrases that'll totally change meaning or lose meaning altogether. You look back in the 1600s, and we see, for example, they use what we call the Old English. Ought, forth, ye, thy, sheweth, right? These kind of words. And eventually that stops being used, except in the King James Bible, which is the translation still being widely used even 200 years later, right? So that's where that language still ends up being occurring. By the 1800s, the only place language like that continued to be used was in association with God and church, because the King James is still the primary version being used. So go read literature from that time period, and you see the Old English has been abandoned for the Declaration of Independence, for example. You don't see it there. The language had been abandoned by the late 1700s. Now, if you reason through that, over the years, many people would have probably begun unconsciously to associate 1600s English with God and religion, because that's where you would always see it, right? It appears that to many it began to be thought of as a special religious, even inspired English dialect. Like that's the way God would speak to, like if he opened up the ceiling here, that's how he would talk to us today. He would use that dialect because it's kind of holy. As though the King James dialect was actually inspired by God. Now, it must be the case that that is what happened, or millions of people wouldn't have been so easily duped by Joseph Smith. In actuality, of course, God didn't use Old English terminology when he transmitted the Bible to us through the Bible readers in the first century and before, because it didn't exist, right? English doesn't exist at that point. He used Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, which don't use the Old Englishisms, of course, of the 17th century. And so when we look in the 1600s and see thee and thou and thy, there's nothing holy about that. It's just the singular forms of you and your, and modern English has just lumped those together. Now if you say, you're in trouble, you don't know if it's a single person or a group, because we've lumped it all together into the word you and your. But it was split in the 1600s, and we've lost that now. So for example, you look at 2 Samuel 12:7. Nathan is confronting David for his sin with Bathsheba. And Nathan speaking to David, a single person. New King James says, you are the man. What does the King James have? Thou art the man, right? Singular person, thou art, right? So it's just, there's no anything holy about saying it that way. That's just the way people talked in the 1600s. All right, now, this is why that's important. The Book of Mormon is translated in 1830, over 200 years after the King James, by Joseph Smith, he says, with God's guidance. And yet, throughout the Book of Mormon, the Old English is used. Okay? You can go look at the original, and it's loaded with it. I mean, even more. It's almost like over the top. Okay, so why would God translate the Book of Mormon in the 19th century with old 17th century English instead of using 19th century American English? Well, he wouldn't. For the same reason he wouldn't speak to us today in Australian English or medieval English. He would use our dialect. All right, so why does the Book of Mormon contain the Old English dialect? Well, you can reason through this. Apparently, Joseph Smith wanted to give his translation credibility, and it worked like a charm. Religious people would be more likely to believe in the book by making it sound like the holy, inspired dialect of the King James, so he used it. It sounded like God's word, right? More likely that people are going to accept it. In fact, the Book of Mormon contains over 17,000 words copied straight out of the King James, even sections that we now realize were not the best translation. Like, for example, when you understand the underlying language, the singular form of the word cherub, it's just cherub. The plural form in Hebrew is cherubim. Okay, why did the Book of Mormon have cherubims? Doesn't make any sense if you understand the underlying language. Well, again, the Book of Mormon does those kind of things. So we got a book that goes into a lot of this stuff, what the Bible says about the Mormon church. But his ruse worked and continues to work with the millions of gullible people that have professed to be Mormon. I don't mean to be unkind, but it is gullible to fall for this. If you're really logically thinking, if you're really pursuing the truth on this, then you should not go with Mormonism. This is not logical to do that. The Book of Mormon proves itself to be of human origin. And this is just one example, again, of flaws. The Book of Mormon is the product of a man who wished to fool people into following him and accepting his distorted teachings and practices. You go back and look at his teachings at the time, you'll see what I mean. Now, the same process can be done with any material that claims to be of divine origin. The Book of Mormon is just one of those few materials that claims to be from God. And each of these can be studied to detect whether they appear to be from humans duping the masses or from a divine being. So about the Quran, it's riddled with similar issues. Again, probably due to Muhammad's desire to lend credibility to the Quran copies liberally from the Jewish Talmud. Again, you have to go study the Jewish Talmud to see that that's what's going on, but the Quran is clearly copying from the Talmud. What does that matter? Well, the Talmud is a collection of Jewish fables, myths, and stories that were circulating in Muhammad's area at the time, and it's not even claimed to be inspired by the Jews. This is just their oral traditions that they've passed down. He probably wouldn't have known that whenever he's hearing these stories around a campfire at the time from the Jews of his time giving these stories. So he borrows the tales from the Talmud, adds them to the Quran to try to give credibility as attempts to persuade the Jews, for example, in the area to start following him. This is a fascinating study, by the way. In this book here that we have at AP, The Quran Unveiled, that my dad wrote, explores this in depth, where you can see these kind of things. Like, for example, there's the story of, I mean, don't you kind of want to have a little bit more information about what's going on with Joseph and Potiphar's wife? Well, the Talmud explores this. I mean, it makes up this extravagant story that it involves, like, Potiphar's wife. She's trying to convince all of her girlfriends. They're like, how are you falling for this slave guy? I mean, what's the deal? And she's like, man, he's just so attractive. I just can't help myself. Which, by the way, girls, that tell this, you know, a guy wrote this book, right? So she has all of her girlfriends over, and she has Joseph come in to serve them. And he comes in, and they're so smitten by his beauty that they all have oranges in their hand, they're cutting them, and they accidentally all cut their hands, and there's blood going everywhere and stuff. I mean, the Talmud goes into this. Well, you see this story in the Quran, but it leaves out key details where it doesn't make sense. It's as though somebody heard the story orally and then forgot key details to put. You have to go to the Talmud to see what's going on. Again, this is the kind of thing you expect from humans writing these things and trying to dupe people into believing them so that they'll have followers and get out of them whatever it is they're wanting to get. Now, the Bible is different. It has characteristics that prove it to be superhuman. And you've, I'm sure, studied these characteristics many times. Let's do just a little survey of some of these. The unity of the Bible. Okay, would you, okay, we want to make predictions here. I try to be scientific here, okay? Did humans write the Bible and just make it up and it's not really from God? Well, would you expect 40 men from diverse backgrounds, including kings, a scribe, farmer, fisherman, tax collector, shepherd, Gentile physician, tree doctor, prophets, tent maker, soldier, cupbearer, and so forth, 40 individuals spread out over some 1,600 years, writing in 3 different languages, to be able to agree on the things discussed in the Bible without contradicting or disagreeing with each other? Okay, get 10 people of the same background living at the same time in a room and get them to agree on what the best ball team is. Right? Right. So humans don't do this, especially. They're spread out over time, different backgrounds, and yet they're agreeing on things way more important here. Discussing things like the afterlife, the meaning of life. There's volumes on that. Right? What constitutes right and wrong? Politics, economics, medicine, psychology, philosophy, history, grammar, science, logic, even the future. And they don't disagree with each other? There's never been one contradiction be able to be sustained against the Bible? That's not human, people. That's not human. Now, again, keep in mind, you wouldn't expect perfect harmony from 40 men with the same background living at the same time. This is, you'd expect at the very least discrepancies, if not outright contradictions, disagreements with each other. Yet the Bible has perfect unity. That's superhuman. What about the brevity and omissions of the Bible? Would you expect humans to write about all those things, all things that pertain to life and godliness? in a brief enough way that all of it could be printed into one relatively small book that could be carried around in a purse. Humans are notoriously verbose, right? We'll write entire multiple volumes on any one single topic. I mean, just look at all the commentaries that are out there. You go into the library, there's an entire sections devoted to just tons and tons of books on one little thing. The Bible, even though it's writing about key, eternally significant things, is very brief and omits a lot of things that if humans were writing it, we'd do it differently. So for example, would you expect humans to leave out the bulk of Jesus's childhood? Okay, now if you're making up a religion and you want people to read your book so that you can convert them to your religion and they'll follow you, right? Well, you want to tell them the kind of stories they want to know about. Don't you want to know about Jesus' childhood? Don't you have some questions about that first 30 years of his life and you only get like 2 things in there? You know, was Jesus ever spanked? You know, what was Jesus' friends like? Did he have friends? Or were they like, oh man, this know-it-all? You know, what was his childhood like? Well, tough. You don't get to know that. I mean, you as a human might want to know that, but that's not relevant to the story that you need to know from God. That's not relevant to what a human would want to know. So you don't get to have it, right? How about squeeze the momentous events of the first 30 years of church history into one small book? You think that's significant? You get the book of Acts. And you notice how some of the apostles just disappeared? You don't know what happened to them? Again, if humans are writing this, don't you want to explore that? I mean, there's all kinds of, that's what the Catholics have done. The Catholics, have their traditions of Thomas went to South America or whatever. The Bible doesn't tell you. Like, it leaves out the kind of things, if you're wanting to fool everybody, it leaves out the kind of things you would want to put in there so that people would want to read your book, right? The stuff that would be really sensational, right, to know about. Well, tough, you don't get to know about all that. How about give the meaning of life in a mere 12-chapter book? Right? The book of Ecclesiastes. Again, the meaning of life, people are still trying to figure that out today. Right? He sorted that out for us very succinctly. Right? Thousands of years ago, really, in one verse. Right? How about this one? Explain the origin of the universe in one chapter. That one really bothers me. How exactly are words spoken without really a mouth or vocal cords? They're spoken by a spiritual being. How does that bring stuff from nothing? And don't you want to know what the tree of life looked like and what that fruit tasted like? And the tree of knowledge, what about the serpent? What does he look like? Well, and what did Adam and Eve look like? They had to have been, attractive. God directly created, there's no mutations in their genome. They're exactly the way God originally designed them to be. You think about all the questions that if humans were writing this, it would be way different, right? You don't get to hear about it because it's not relevant to the story that God is trying to tell us. Essentially, the story is how he fixes Genesis 3:6, right? Through what he promises in Genesis 3:15. How about the objectivity of the Bible? Would you expect humans to write disparaging comments about themselves or their friends for the whole world to read over the coming centuries and to do so completely dispassionately and impartially? Again, think about it. You're trying to get people to follow you. You want to make yourself look good. You and your buddies, you want to look very pious and religious so that everybody wants to emulate you. They want to follow you. You're not going to want to say things that make you look like an idiot. You're like, hey, right when it really counted, we all bailed on Jesus. Just want y'all to know that. Right? I think you just lost a lot of your followers there. Right? Those are not kind of things you'd include in there, but they'll throw that in there. It's as though there's this superintending hand holding them back from doing what they would otherwise do if they were allowed to do what they would normally do as human. And to do it dispassionately and impartially, do you think it was easy for John to write down the things that he was writing down in his epistle? I would hazard a guess that he might have had to throw the scroll out a couple times because of the tears all over it that would have ruined the ink. You know, think about what he's having to write down. And Matthew, the things that they're writing down about themselves and what happened to Jesus, can you imagine the conviction you would feel? And yet it doesn't come out in the writing. It's very dispassionate and impartial, as though it is not humans really writing this. See what I'm saying? Scientific foreknowledge, this characteristic we look at a lot. Several laws of science I've found accurately stated in the Bible. Now, the Bible is not a science textbook. It's really more of a history book. But anything it touches on with regard to science is always accurate. And in fact, there's a lot of things we've been able to learn by looking at what the Bible says on scientific matters. It's one of the evidences of its inspiration. Let's look at just a few examples of this. For example, Genesis 17:12, we see this circumcision idea that God implements with Abraham there. He who is 8 days old shall be circumcised. And then we see it in the law of Moses as well. In Leviticus 12, on the 8th day the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised. And we think through, okay, so humans are making this up. This isn't God. So why would you pick the 8th day? To the Semitic mind, numbers are kind of a big deal, right? Like more than what we can really fathom here. But like if you're wanting to have a procedure that all of your boys are going to go through, that symbolizes you cutting off the world and cleansing yourself of that and being holy, set apart from the world. What day do you think you would select if you're a Jew? Maybe 7. 7 was significant to the Jew. 12, 3, these are very big, important numbers. Why would you pick 8? There is no symbolism that fits with 8. After the fact, we've gone back and said, well, I mean, 8, can be used this way, but there is no evidence that to the Jews there was any significance to the number 8. Why would you pick 8? Well, it's interesting. This Danish scientist got a Nobel Prize in 1943 because in 1935 he discovered that there is this factor that he calls vitamin K that makes it where it helps your blood clotting. It makes it where if you get cut, you don't bleed out as easily. All right, so he gets a Nobel Prize for figuring this out, the significance of vitamin K. So blood clotting, we now know, depends on the production of prothrombin by the liver. Vitamin K stimulates the liver to produce the prothrombin. So if you're deficient in vitamin K, then you're going to be deficient in prothrombin, and therefore you're going to tend to be more likely to bleed too much when you get a cut. There's more likelihood that you're going to bleed out. All right. Well, this guy that is a pioneer of pediatric medicine, he wrote in this book, there is a peculiar susceptibility to bleeding between the 2nd and 5th days of life. Right? Some reason there's more likelihood of bleeding, like you don't clot as well. Well, do you think that that's important information to know if you're going to be carrying out a procedure on a child? It's kind of important to know, isn't it? Vitamin K production and absorption in the newborn male, we now know, increases on the 5th through the 8th day of life. So here's a chart that shows what is going on here. So between days 2 and 5, we see an increased susceptibility to bleeding, and we know why. It's because prothrombin is lower. Then you see vitamin K increasing, and so prothrombin increases. It is only on the 8th day that vitamin K causes the percent of prothrombin to climb above 100%. And then after that, it goes back down 100% and levels off for the rest of the child's life. It is literally the perfect day to perform circumcision. All right, so how did Moses know to stipulate? You think it was trial and error? You think he just butchered little boys until he figured this out? Well, there's no way. He didn't know why the eighth day, right? He just said what God told him to say. We've just figured this out in the last century. Scientific foreknowledge. How about in oceanography? You got to be careful about quoting Job. As the Bible's inspired, but that doesn't mean that everything that every person says in there is accurate. The Bible quotes Satan, for example. You don't want to quote him. And Job's friends, God makes it clear they said things that weren't accurate about him. But when God's talking, okay, now you know you're in good shape here. God, when he's humbling Job, makes these statements about things to humble Job with his lack of knowledge about all kinds of things. And one of them is he mentions, hey, have you entered into the springs of the sea? Okay, and this idea of the springs, sources of gushing and bubbling water. Well, now we've figured out, hey, sure enough, there's springs on the floor of the ocean. Of course, Job hadn't entered these. And he's living, I would argue, post-flood, pre-Abraham. This is thousands of years ago. This one's even more fascinating. The recesses of the deep, referring to the ocean. There's recesses of how would Job have known anything about recesses in the ocean? The deep places or caverns of the ocean. It wasn't until the 1800s that we actually started deep sea exploration, got technology that allowed us to start seeing, sure enough, there's recesses down there, like the Mariana Trench. And it wasn't until 1960 we actually could go down to the deepest point, 8 tons of pressure per square inch in order to get down there, almost 7 miles deep. And now we've discovered 22 such trenches in various oceans. All right, so God asks, have you entered into the springs of the sea or walked in the recesses of the deep? How would the writer of Job have known that there were such things? Of course, unless God told him, which is what the text says. Keeping in mind, God is doing this from a whirlwind. Imagine what that would have been like as he's saying these things. Another attribute of the Bible that proves it to be beyond human capability, the predictive prophecy of the Bible. How good are weathermen and sportscasters at foretelling the future? Not very good, right? And yet the details of some of these prophecies in the Bible, we've got some really great stuff at AP on this. Probably my favorite one recently has been Matthew 24 and what Jesus prophesied about the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. It blows my mind, the details in that. But let's look at an example here from Ezekiel about Tyre. Okay, came to pass on the 11th year on the first day of the month, the word of the Lord came to me, Ezekiel, saying, Son of man, because Tyre has said against Jerusalem, aha, she is broken, who is the gateway of the peoples. Now she is turned over to me. I shall be filled. She is laid waste, right? Because Tyre has said that. Behold, I am against you, O Tyre, and will cause many nations to come up against you, as the sea causes its waves to come up, and they shall destroy the walls of Tyre and break down her towers, for I have spoken, says the Lord God. All right, now you have to understand how unlikely this would have been for Ezekiel, for this to have been said at that time. Because Tyre was basically undefeatable. I mean, how are you going to besiege a city when you can't even put your siege equipment on land because the walls of the city go into the ocean? Like, Tyre was considered undefeatable. Like, people could not do this. So Ezekiel he starts giving all these specific little details about the future destruction of Tyre. It shall become plunder for the nations. Also her daughter villages, or the suburbs, which are in the field, shall be slain by the sword. Then they shall know that I am the Lord. For thus says the Lord God, behold, I'll bring against Tyre from the north Nebuchadnezzar. Here's one of these many nations. You're going to bring Babylon against him. With horses, chariots, horsemen, an army with many people. He will slay with the sword your suburbs in the fields. He'll heap up a siege mount against you, build a wall against you, raise a defense against you. They'll break down your walls and destroy your pleasant houses. They'll lay your stones, your timber, and your soil in the midst of the water. I'll put an end to the sound of your songs. The sound of your harps shall be heard no more. No more music. I'll make you like the top of a rock. How strange is that? You shall be a place for spreading nets, and you shall never be rebuilt. For I, the Lord, have spoken, says the Lord God. So a lot of very specific prophecies that are given here that leave Ezekiel open to making errors in this, if he's just making this up. Psychics, right? When they're doing what they do, they're going to be very vague. Tomorrow you're going to see a person with a red shirt. Okay, that's going to be hard for that. Now, these are very specific things he's saying here that are going to happen. And we can look at history and see how these play out. Historically, we know Ezekiel began prophesying in 592 BC. Tyre is a coastal city. Sure enough, 586 BC, Nebuchadnezzar, he comes and besieges it. Finally takes it in 573 BC. The inland part, but a lot of the people had escaped to the island portion of the city. It's about 3/4 of a mile offshore. And Nebuchadnezzar gave up on taking the island militarily because of this wall issue. And for 241 years, the situation remains basically the same. And then guess who comes along? 332 BC, Alexander the Great comes. And he wants a challenge. So he decides to come after the island. But in order to do it, he's got to get to it so he can have his siege equipment and all. He's got to get across the water. So in order to get to the island and conquer it, he has his army gather all the remaining materials from the coastland part, the wood, the stones, even the dirt. Scrape it clean of materials, making it bald like a rock, and dumps that material into the ocean to make a land bridge to the island, which you can still see today with Google Earth. And so he was able to go in there and smash them. Now, the city still remained somewhat intact over the next 1,600 years, and sure enough, many nations continued to just come against this until finally the Mamluks, who were former Muslim soldier slaves, came in AD 1291 and thoroughly crushed Tyre, where now they don't even know for sure where exactly it was. They think that at least the island portion, you can see it still underwater. But the portion on the land, they don't even know exactly where that was. It was so eradicated, so scraped clean. It's obviously never regained the position it once had. So Ezekiel looks 1,900 years into the future and predicts all of these things. Travelers who go and visit this area today say that only a small colony of people are actually there in that island part. And guess what they do for a living? They fish with nets. Okay? Now, how in the world could Ezekiel have done that? Well, he couldn't. And he didn't even claim to. He only told people what he said God told him to say. That's superhuman, okay? Superhuman characteristics. Again, we have a lot of materials on this topic at AP. I've only touched the hem of the garment on this. So many specific divine characteristics. We didn't even get to start talking about the perfect accuracy of the Bible, about all the little details, like he went down from Jerusalem. There's all kinds of topical references. Everything is perfectly accurate on all these little things. We can know that God exists. It's not a blind faith to believe in a God. And we can know specifically that it is the God of the Bible. And you'll seek me and find me when you search for me with all your heart. That's the key, though. We can know which God exists. We can know that it's the God of the Bible. Know that the Lord, that's the word for Jehovah there, He is God. That's something we can know. We can know that the Bible's inspired. And after you know that, it's just a matter of figuring out what, if anything, He expects of us. Let me tell you a few other items here that we have back there in the back that you can look at for your having in your library, or think about others that might need these materials. Jude 3, I found it necessary to write to you, exhorting you to contend earnestly for the faith. Are we doing that? Are we contending? Would we describe ourselves each week or even each year? Would we say, yeah, I'm a Christian. I contend earnestly for the faith? Is that something that we would think that we even do? This is what we're expected to do. We have a monthly Christian Evidences journal where we are writing articles on the latest things that we feel like you need to be ready to talk to other people about. Various apologetics issues. It's not all science-y. Some of it's more Bible. Some of it's philosophy. There's all kinds of stuff in there. Things that we feel like you need to be. Again, we're trying to study these things and get it ready for you to use. So it's about $1.25 a month to get a subscription to that. A lot of the materials we've written over the years, we've put into book form where it's all organized in that way for you. The first session that I did tonight is basically a summary of a lot of the material in this book, Does God Exist? This goes much more in depth into that stuff. The second session was basically some of the material from this and some other things. Is the Bible God's Word? There's really three pillars of the Christian faith that undergird everything: the existence of God, the inspiration of the Bible, and the deity of Christ. That's an essential component too. Does the Bible teach that Jesus is divine? That's the purpose of this book. And is there actually evidence for Jesus? That we know He actually existed, that He wasn't just made up. Probably one of the number one arguments people try to use against the Bible, they try to say, oh, the Bible has thousands of contradictions in it, little errors. And these volumes were written to show you each one of those. The Bible can explain as to what's actually going on. There's never been one contradiction that's been able to be sustained against the Bible. Christian's Guide to Refuting Modern Atheism. This is a transcript of Kyle Butt's debate with Dan Barker that I quoted from some tonight, as well as a lot of other material that Kyle didn't have time to get into in that debate. But this is exploring the big arguments that atheists try to use against the God of the Bible today. You know, God's a homophobe and He's sexist. I mean, He has the men, over the women, and He's genocidal. I mean, He has the Israelites come in and wipe out entire populations, and He endorses slavery, and He's racist. He's got, the Jews picked out as more important than everybody else. And all these big arguments that people try to use against the God of the Bible dealt with in this book very thoroughly. Surveying the Evidence is our flagship book, giving you a little chapter on a lot of different areas of Christian evidences. There's a chapter on the existence of God, inspiration of the Bible, the deity of Christ, as well as the age of the earth, dealing with evolution, a lot of different specific things, giving you a little taste of each of these to prepare you to talk to people about any number of Christian evidences issues. Dinosaur delusion. Dinosaurs have been the poster children of evolution for decades. Dinosaurs clearly existed, so are they evidence of evolution or not? Christian creationists would say God created all land creatures on day 6 along with humans. We weren't separated evolutionarily by 63 million years. So is there evidence that humans and dinosaurs coexisted in the past? That's what this book is exploring, that evidence. This is a book going through some of the evidences of the inspiration of the Bible that are not covered in that other book. This one is just on a single issue with regard to the inspiration of the Bible, and that is a prophecy that's made in the Old Testament that comes true in the book of Acts. A deep dive study on that. Probably the number one argument that people use against the God of the Bible is the question of suffering, evil, pain, and suffering. How can God be all-powerful if he allows bad things to happen to innocent people and good people. Either he's not all powerful or he's not loving enough to stop it. And therefore the God of the Bible doesn't exist. This is the argument, probably the number one argument people have used for centuries. And this book explores, what does the Bible really teach about this? What does the Bible really have to say about this question of suffering? So think about this from a perspective of not just apologetics, but think about people you know that are going through suffering that might actually be questioning God right now because of what they're going through. So this book's really good at kind of helping them think through what's going on there. This is my book on science versus evolution that goes through, I barely touched the hem of the garment on 3 of the laws of science in our last session, but I go in depth into 6 areas, 6 laws of science in this book, as well as all of the quibbles people bring up against those arguments, from quantum mechanics to the multiverse and symbiogenesis and all kinds of other technical things, but that's what this book is about. Is Christianity logical? Again, a lot of people within Christendom are not helping our case by teaching that Christianity really is this blind faith idea. And this book explores really what the Bible teaches on this, showing that the Bible, Jesus, for example, was a master logician, very logical in making arguments and so forth. Really fascinating little booklet. Behemoth and Leviathan. When I was telling you God is talking to Job, humbling him, he mentions these 2 amazing creatures at the end of his discourse with Job. And this book explores the potential identity of those creatures. Scientists speak out about God and evolution. This is several of our brotherhood scientists that have done writing for us at AP, where we take some of their articles where they're talking about evolution and so forth and put it together into a single book of a PhD scientist writing about all various things that deal with God and evolution. We've got a ton of tracts, but some are in this what we call the Reasons to Believe series. And the point of these is to succinctly address some very fundamental issues that the society around us is totally losing. Okay, we got traction, of course, on all kinds of things. But they're not necessarily the kind of tracts that you would leave everywhere, because they deal with maybe just some off-the-wall issue that, as opposed to, does God exist? Is the Bible really from God? Is Jesus really God? See, these are more fundamental, foundational issues that are being lost around us. So we came up with a series, and there's more in this series. The purpose of these is for you to get these en masse and leave them all over the place, everywhere you're going. Leave these tracts, in case people will pick it up and get solidified on some of these foundational issues. The 3 pillars of faith tracts on the existence of God, inspiration, Bible, deity of Christ were pulled together into this little booklet, as well as a chapter on salvation. So this is another evangelistic tool that's a good thing to have to hand to people. Well, we also have other tract series that you could be aware of as well that get into more specific things. Lots of culture war materials. What does the Bible say about environmentalism and homosexuality and abortion and the founders of our country, illegal immigration, God and Government, fascinating book. I wish every young person before they go to college would study this. Really what the Bible teaches about any number of issues. You think about, let's say I think I'm going to go start my own country. I find an island that nobody's ever found before. Okay, this is going to be my island. Okay, and I'm going to create my own government here. All right, now, what kind of government am I going to make? Well, I want it to be something that God would want me to make. Has God weighed in on this? Well, that's basically what the Old Testament is. Right? It is God's endorsement of a civil law code. If you strip it of the specific religious components, then you have this skeleton for what God would say on punishment of evildoers, immigration, taxation. There's all kinds of stuff in there that clearly the founders of our country realized. You go back and look at the actual, not what the revisionist historians have said in the last 100 years, but go back and look at the primary documents. The founders of our country realized that, and we're going to the Bible and trying to set up our nation to have these principles in it. It's a fascinating study. That's what this book is looking at. You can see why I'd say I wish every young person would read this before they go to college, because what do you think they're going to learn in college? It's going to be a bunch of godless, socialism and communism concepts that are not from the mind of God. This is a book I co-authored with my dad on this important topic of homosexuality. I dealt with more the science and psychology side. Dad dealt with the scripture side of things. There's also materials that we've put out. Sometimes Dad and I will put out stuff that is not really as much apologetic-y, so we just do that separately. So he did a book on quotes about the founders that are taken out of context, that are not really what the founders were meaning when they said various things. I argue that Satan's most effective approach to getting our nation has been to attack the home. It really doesn't matter what he does with fill in the blank, pornography, drugs, all the crazy stuff we got going on in our society. If he can destroy the home, then he's destroyed the nucleus of the society, and that's what he's done. He's rewritten the home over the last several decades, where people don't rear their children in the right way. They don't carry out roles in the home the way God set it up in Scripture. They don't, much less are they thinking about their posterity and what that remember one of the reasons God picked Abraham to be the one through whom Jesus would ultimately come. Genesis 18:19, he says it's because he knows him, that he'll command his children and his household after him. Abraham was mindful of not just his own children, but he was thinking towards his posterity. All that's been lost because we're too busy being carnally minded. So I've been writing this series of books dealing with that. This is back to AP books, what the Bible says about any number of specific churches and their doctrines and so forth. Instrumental music, baptism in the Greek made simple. This is where Dad just goes below the English and gets down to the Greek, but in a very simple way where layman Christians can understand. The Greek so shows the essentiality of baptism. There's just really no way to argue it. Modern day miracles. Do miracles happen today? Again, we've got denominational groups that think that they do. What does the Bible really teach about that? The end times. Again, you got a huge percentage of the denominational world has misunderstandings about, for example, the events of the book of Revelation and what the Bible really teaches about what's going to happen in the end. And so this really delves into that topic. What else we got here? This is a fascinating book that Dad wrote. This gets into things that you can learn deeper about the Bible by having more understanding of certain things going on in biblical culture or even in biblical languages that can give you a deeper understanding of various texts. Very fascinating book. Book on lifting up hands. This is a book that every new Christian should have. Imagine being a new Christian, and you're like, okay, well, you're a Christian. You need to be sure to read your Bible. Good luck. And so they open their Bible that night, and they start trying to read Leviticus and Hebrews, right? And any number of books, Ezekiel, and you're trying to understand it. The purpose of this book is in like 1 to 2 pages to give you a summary of each book of the Bible. So all 66 books, 1 or 2 pages each, giving you an outline, summary, basic thematic verse in many cases, give you the thrust of each of these so you can approach the book with the right glasses on, so to speak, to make sure that you can understand better what you're reading. Female leadership in the church, that's not an issue today, is it? And if you're unaware of our study Bible, very popular, our Defending the Faith study Bible. This is not a normal study Bible. Usually you go buy a study Bible from Nelson, for example. It's going to have a running commentary of what various verses mean. This is an apologetic study Bible. So this helps prepare you for any apologetics issues that'll come up that have to do with any number of things on the various pages as you're studying that section of Scripture. And lots of different cover styles we have on this, tabs and so forth. We're fixing to release a large print. We're fixing to have it in Spanish as well. And then we also released, as you all know, a kind of abbreviated Bible that just has a handful of articles in there. The full-size one, it has hundreds of our apologetics articles pared down and put in relevant places to give you a good response to the kind of things you're going to hear from the world. Again, this is important for young people to have before they go off to college. And we also have it digitally. You can get it on Kindle or through this Olive Tree app as well. All right, wrapping this session up here. Remember, I mentioned to you that I was there in Arkansas, and I mentioned to those, that professor came up to me, how do you know that it's not Allah or even the flying spaghetti monster? Which, by the way, if you go, a lot of the universities have a club called the Pastafarians. Pastafarians, right? And the idea is they're making fun of Christianity because they're saying there's just as much evidence for the flying spaghetti monster as there is the God of the Bible. So they call themselves the Pastafarians. And so he was alluding to that by throwing that out there. So I said to him, he said, how do you know that it's the God of the Bible? And I said, well, we don't have a blind faith. We have evidence that it's specifically the God of the Bible. Oh, yeah, sure. I want to hear this. I said, yeah, we have a book that has supernatural characteristics that humans could not have produced. And he sat there. Little drool coming. Then he goes, really? Oh, yeah, we don't have a blind faith. We got plenty of evidence of this. He sat there again. Well, I want to see this. Now I'm sitting there going, drool coming in. Because I never get to that point with anybody. People that want to actually see that evidence. Because remember, it's not really about a pursuit of the evidence with most people. They have something they want to believe, right? And then they'll have blind faith in it because they so want to believe it. This doesn't have to do with an actual genuine pursuit of the truth. And I go, well, yeah, we've got this material that'll delve into this, where you can study this yourself. And he goes, well, I don't want to buy any of your materials. I don't want to support your organization, but I'd like to see. One of the elders jumped up real quick and bought him the book. He took that book, and I don't know what he did with it. I never heard from him again. But that's what the purpose of this is. We got to be ready to be able to give that kind of information to people, give them what they need in order to be able to find the truth. And then ultimately, it's going to be up to them. It'll be between them and God in the end. They'll be without excuse if they didn't delve into the evidence and be willing to unbiasedly let the evidence point them in a direction, even if they don't like what the conclusion is, which so many times we don't like the conclusion that the evidence demands, and any number of things too. But here we're just specifically thinking about atheists. All right, so we know God exists. We can know that it's the God of the Bible. We can know that the Bible is inspired by God. So tomorrow, we get to actually start delving into what does the Bible actually teach about a number of things that are so relevant in making sense of the world around us. So we'll start delving into Genesis 1 through 11 and look at what the physical evidence says coupled with what the Bible teaches on this. And it's a fascinating study. So we'll look at the pre-flood world, we'll look at the flood, and we'll look at the post-flood world and the ice age and the Babel dispersion and see what we can learn about these things. And then we'll see whether it can be defended, whether we can actually do real science with these things and defend it. Thank you very much for your attention. I know that was a lot of information tonight, right? But don't worry, tomorrow there's a lot more. So if you have any questions, be sure to come and talk to me. There is supposed to be a Q&A tomorrow. And I guarantee you, you're going to have questions after I delve into this stuff tomorrow. It's so much fascinating stuff. I think you'll probably have some other questions about it. And the material bank at the back, if you have questions about that, let me know as well. I can take a card if you need to pay by card. You can scan and pay by Venmo or PayPal as well, and use cash and checks as well. So just let me know if you need any help on that. All right, Glenn, I'll pass it over to you. Thank you again for your attention.
Tomorrow morning, again at 9 a.m. Everyone to be here, bring family, friends, and I'd like to close with a prayer if we could. Our Father who art in heaven, to be able to approach at this time is a blessing within itself. We realize the importance of prayer, the importance of approaching you, not just in bad times, but in good times, anytime. We're thankful for Dr. Miller and the time that he's taken to be here with us, to teach us the things that are important to not only our physical growth, but our eternal place in heaven one day. Pray for continued success in the seminar this weekend. We'll leave here not only rewarded, but have a deeper knowledge of you and understanding those before us, actual meanings of the inspired word. Answer some of the questions that we may have. Thank you for the material that's available in the Bible. Open up our minds and our hearts to things that we may question ourselves or want a deeper understanding of. We pray that all who departed this evening will be safe on the way home. If we come here tomorrow, we look forward to the whole day, any time in your word. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Amen.